Good.
Yeah, let's do it.
Cool. So, thank you so much for being on our Urgent Futures Reality Studies Substack live. Um, so, for everyone watching and later listening, I'm joined today by Megan Mayhew-Bergman. I guess to start, it sort of makes sense to start at the start. You do a lot of things. So I'd love if you could introduce yourself via quick sketch. Like, who are you? What do you do? What do you care about?
Oh, wow. Quick sketch is that, I'm a tiny Southern witch that lives in Vermont. I think the larger sketch is, yeah, I care about the environment and I care about unusual women, and I'm just a storyteller. So sometimes that gets channeled through fiction, sometimes it's journalism, and in the last 2 years I've gotten into documentaries. So I'm blessed and cursed by caring about a lot of things, and I just channel that in different directions. I'm the director of creative writing at Middlebury College. I'm the director of the Bread Loaf Environmental Writers Conference, and I have a consulting firm called GreenStory where I help clean tech and nonprofits with storytelling.
Amazing. And my hope is that we get to touch on all of those things today, time permitting. But given where you started that intro, it seems to make sense to start with your most recent book, How Strange a Season. I think to start, let's start with the title. Talk to me about the calculus behind why that book is called what it is.
God, titles are such heartaches, and when you get a good one, it's such a gift. I love a good title. I pine for a good title. It arrives in the subconscious mind, but this one came to me when I was reading a translation of the Italian poet Patricia Cavalli, and she had a poem where one of the lines was "How strange a season," and for me, it like struck that immediate chord. I know Hemingway and Fitzgerald used to mine. I'm sorry, that's my rescue cat knocking down boxes. Used to used to mine the Bible for phrases. I think like "For whom the bell tolls," like they would mine different texts to find just that like perfect cluster of words. And I think the subconscious mind works so well for writers if you believe in that channel because it's functioning 10,000 times faster than our conscious mind. And so there are times where I just feel like I open it and I feel like a title search is one of those ways.
Mm. I have other questions I want to get to, but I have to stay here for a minute. Like, talk to me more about the role of the subconscious in not just finding titles, but also like your entire practice as a writer and storyteller.
Yeah, I remember when AI first hit, and there was the writer's strike, and someone was holding a sign, and it says AI doesn't have childhood trauma. And when I was trying to encourage my students, and I use AI in other aspects of my life, I'm not rigid about it, but I do think it poses a danger to the most mystical parts of writing, and I think it's important for writers to stay open to that which I mean, a machine can sound like it's talking about childhood trauma, but it doesn't actually have the childhood trauma or all that kind of magic synergy. And it's working faster than my brain works. But I think that glimmering special access and braiding together of unusual experiences and personal experiences, that sort of like shimmering stuff that's hard to put words to, I think that happens. For me, it happens deeper in the recesses of my mind and my dream life when I'm on a run or a long walk or it's that deeper stuff that I find so rewarding as an artist and that I think has allowed me to find the most magical moments in my writing, whether it's a great title or a last line or an idea. And I love protecting those parts and just reminding myself that they exist and they're possible.
Mm. Oh, I love that. And how does that inform, like, obviously there's the writing practice, the writer's life, but there's also the fact that you're deeply engaged in issues of climate crisis. Like, how do you find it weaving into that kind of dimension of your life?
Yeah. Um, I was on a run maybe at this point, it must have been 12 years ago, maybe more, and it was one of the winters where it hadn't really snowed in Vermont, and I thought, "Oh god, we're not gonna solve this." Like, humans don't have what it takes to make the sacrifices and the hard decisions to do what we need to do. Like, my faith in our collective ability to truly meet the moment just crumbled. There was something where I thought, "I have to go all in. I have to do what I can," and that's as a storyteller, and I've always thought that I have a unique ability it sounds like I'm patting myself on the back, and I guess I am, but I think of myself as standing on the bridge, sometimes between art. I'm a science literate person and an art literate person. I've lived in the North and South. I've moved across socioeconomic, geographic regions, and I think of all of those as acts of translation, and I think it's one of the most powerful things a storyteller can do. And I've heard there were a couple articles a few years ago where people called the climate crisis the result of a communications failure. And I think about that all the time. The fact that we knew and that we didn't convert. And I don't think it's necessarily a communications failure, although I think that's a part of it. I think it's a failure to listen and change behavior and the scale. Um, but those are problems that my brain feels obsessed with solving. And I think this, after a lot of field work and study and pouring a lot of different things in there and exposure, I think my mind does enjoy kind of braiding together arts and science.
Mm. And how do you, like, given your, I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth here, but the kind of like, um, maybe not nihilism, but the fatalism of like, wow, I really don't think we're going to do what we need to do. How do you orient yourself toward that struggle? Like, how do you motivate yourself toward that struggle with that simultaneous awareness?
Yeah, sometimes I feel guilty when I say what I really think about that. I think we have the tools to solve it. I don't think we have the will collectively. I think a lot of us have the will collectively, although I won't say that I'm always, walking the line. I fly places, I do things, but so there's such an interesting discussion in the climate community about optimism versus pessimism. And the writer Nathaniel Rich once gave a brilliant lecture at Bread Loaf where he talked about how Americans versus Europeans, Americans sort of want the Marvel movie version of climate change, that some tech genius is going to rush in at the last minute and save us all. And yeah. and I recently saw something where someone said, look, we can solve this. We can make a meaningful dent. We have the tools. We have the emerging technology. We're just going to have to bridge a couple decades where we're still experiencing consequences. And that, I think, is a believable potential path. The other thing I think about is our job really as conscious people, socially conscious people, is to reduce suffering in the world. And there are always ways to reduce suffering, whether it's reducing the speed of, climate consequence or just hyper locally feeding someone, creating habitat, all those things that Jane Goodall was always preaching about of like, we can live a more peaceful life, we can reduce suffering in the world. So when in doubt on like the big, bewildering global scale, I sort of think about that.
Mm. RIP to a great one.
Yeah, really, truly a great one.
Yeah. One thing, I mean, this is, like nobody can hold a candle to her legacy, but one thing I've really been thinking of in the wake of her passing is this question of hope and optimism. And I find myself really deeply wrestling with that. And I've read compelling things on either side of that question. I forget who I was reading, but this writer, whoever it was, sorry for not remembering who you are, had kind of grouped Jane Goodall and Bill McKibben and a lot of the leading earlier climate activists' commitment to needing hope as being well-intentioned but ultimately problematic. That
Mhm.
like by having to have the thing at the end of the article that says like, but good things are happening and like that is like there's like a soporific effect or there's like a deadening effect of like, no, it is an emergency. Like the alarms are blaring and you have to move. And so I wrestle with that and I wonder, given what you've just said, like how are you thinking about that?
I love that question. Also, my rescue cat is on the move, and my mom doesn't know I have a rescue cat, and I know she's on right now. So, hi, mom. I have a cat. Um,
So it's
uh,
Suds' first public appearance.
yes, that's he's right here. There's his tail. Oh, and he just fell. Um, so the optimism versus pessimism, and the purveyors and like promoters of optimism. I think there's probably the message we really need to hear, and then there's probably what we're willing to hear and will metabolize. And I think people who sort of err on the side of hope are sometimes just aware of what will people actually read, accept, digest, because we won't necessarily read, accept, or digest too much melancholy, too many difficult facts, too much feelings of being complicit in something. Efficacy, I think, is a huge challenge when we think about the messages and the stories we tell about climate. So it's not just about what's real, but it's about what is effective and what is our motive. One thing I heard is that sometimes doing some segmentation about audience really matters here. So I think audience segmentation is the thing I would think about as a journalist or in more nonprofit sort of work or advocacy work. And I think it was one of the Project Drawdown folks who said, we spend so much time focusing on the people who don't believe, and we may not actually be able to convert those folks. And so sometimes the objective should be it's people who are passively aware that climate change is urgent, are not fully activated. So how can you convert the people that are like, I know climate change is an emergency, I know it's real. How do you convert those people into people that are out there writing op-eds, running for office, changing policy, getting rid of their ornamental lawns and creating habitat, being water aware, all those things. Like for me, that's something I've been thinking a lot about. Is just like, how do we convert people from like passively aware to like, I'm in the game? And right now, it feels like in this political moment, we're all a little bit one step back further than 10 steps back further than we should be because we're
I don't know what you're
afraid
talking
and we're
about.
tired. Yeah, right. It's a little quiet out there. So I'm hoping we're all going to feel a little more inspired to make some noise and use our First Amendment rights and, ruffle some feathers and talk about our planet's survival and health and, the level of different levels of suffering that are ahead. But it's quiet.
Mm. I'm loath to fall into the same hopium trap I was just identifying. And I'm loath to try to spin a glass half full sort of scenario out of something
Yeah.
awful.
Yeah.
But one thing I've also been thinking about, and this was prompted after a conversation with Brett Christophers, who he's a human geographer who studies, among other things, energy markets and basically looking at the root causes for why green energy hasn't proliferated and overtaken fossil fuels, even though it's now at price parity.
Yeah.
And we spoke shortly after the election, and he was like, look, it's terrible, but I'm actually less concerned than a lot of my colleagues because it's actually not really that much worse than it was even under Biden.
Mm.
And he said a lot more about that. And so I don't want to like just reduce I am reducing the argument. So folks, go watch that podcast if you want to get his deeper take on that. But that sort of set me down this line of thinking. And I'd heard people say a similar thing around how we were kind of asleep at the wheel, even when we had politicians in place who were theoretically more aligned.
Yeah.
And that the Trump administration and broader MAGA movement are so horrifically bad, like are so obviously repugnant that perhaps there's like an awakening among, localized communities that wasn't happening because there was some lurking sense like, oh, it'll get handled top down. But it's just so obvious that not only will it not be handled top down, but it's actually being dismantled from the top.
Yeah. I mean, it is, the anti-science energy and anti-green energy right now it scares me not in terms of, in terms of everything, but, there's like what's in place now, but it's the growth and the future and the investment and the scale of what, as you say, we were already behind where we should have been under a more progressive administration. So, but I think you're right. The economics are there for clean energy now, and so if we're operating in the world of capitalism and greed and bottom line as we are, I'm hopeful. I don't know about the word, but I think there will be uptake there. I worry deeply about marine protected areas, the health of our ocean, national parks, forest, all the supply and demand when we think about what is fragile that we can't get back with mistakes. And that being on the line, just it can wake me up in the odd hours of the night in a panic. All we can do is advocate passionately, and that's sort of the work I try to do is to enable people. I meet a lot of people who care deeply but who think, "Why me? Why should I step in the ring? Why should I write the op-ed?" But kind of building on what you were saying, that when we can't operate at scale and when we can't operate successfully at the federal policy level, hyperlocal becomes the game. And I think that was missing all along. And I hope that, we we think about conservation at hyperlocal levels, and we think about policy at hyperlocal levels and reducing suffering at hyperlocal levels. I mean, that's where the wins are right now.
Mm. Well, and how does that I'm sorry, I know that I said we were about to talk about How Strange a Season, and we are
Mm.
gonna come back to it, but I'm just really enjoying this thread that we're on. So, again, kind of thinking about your nonfiction practice, when you're writing op-eds, when you're, doing reportage, how are you thinking about, like, especially with that audience segmentation question of, like, what are the creative decisions that you're making both in the construction of the piece, but also maybe at the level of the language, the syntax and grammar, even um, to try to spark that audience per the specific factors related to that segment.
Yeah, the best advice I can give comes from my friend who's an Italian director, Lara Lucchetti. She's brilliant. Whenever we're working together, we're working on the adaptation of one of my stories into a film. I just kind of follow her around with a notepad because the way she phrases everything is a pure delight. But one of the things she told me that I think is the best advice for environmental storytelling, she said, hide the medicine in the cake. And and so I think when it comes to audience segmentation, sometimes it's thinking about what is the cake. Like we're all at a misery saturation index. Like I who care about this stuff deeply wake up and some days I cannot bear to read any more environmental bad news. So sometimes it's thinking what is the cake? What is the story? What is the narrative? What is the beautiful visuals or the beautiful language that can counterbalance some of the medicine? Um, and again, thinking about who are we trying to reach and how do we want them to feel. So again, it's hard to convert people who have their ears plugged entirely to science and compassion. It's, I think, easier to convert people who are in that passively aware category to like activate yourself more deeply and more constructively and more authentically within your realm of influence. And I'm a huge believer in visual storytelling right now. I think I, of course, probably have thoughts about people's reading habits in this era and what that means for my vocation at large as a writer. But I also love visuals, and I think visuals can be a part of that cake, that the medicine goes with. Like my friend Carlton Ward, who's a National Geo photographer, has written a lot about panthers and wildlife corridors. And the visuals, the drone footage, or imagining what this panther has to go through crossing an 8-lane highway in Florida at night in search of food and a mate. It's the cake there, the visuals, I think will lead people to consume a story that they might not otherwise consume.
Mm, I love that. And I love that thinking of cake, again, not in the hopium dimension, but the cake also even just being like aesthetics, like
Yeah.
nice, compelling, surprising aesthetics.
Yeah. We have, as writers and content creators, we have, I think we forget that we are supposed to entertain and inform, and in our clickbaity, scanny, low attention span world, I think we have to create in reality and maybe fight against some of the root causes of some of those issues, right? Like, I think the pendulum, I think we're maybe a little more sick and suspicious of the internet than we used to be in some ways. And, as Anna saying this on the internet is ridiculous. I recognize that. But I think all of us miss our attention spans and we crave deep connection, especially in a darker time. And I have a little faith that, there are ways this might correct itself or return. But for now, yeah, I'm all about that cake, that visual, that beauty, that license to entertain. I also think people are moved by other people's passion. So once I work a lot with Conservation Law Foundation, and one of the articles they asked me to write was about the collapse of the cod fishery. And I was sort of like, oh shit, how do we write about cod? There's the factual report about the collapse of the cod fishery, but how can I make an average reader care about cod? And it's a great narrative problem to solve. And I solved it by talking to this scientist, Dr. Gareth Lawson, who is absolutely passionate about cod. And he said, I wish people could see what I see beneath the waterline. And he painted this gorgeous picture of fish culture and mating columns and the nurseries. And he made it so full of wonder and expertise. And that's how you unlock it. You find somebody else's passion.
Amazing. God, such a great answer. Like my head's swimming, pun intended. Well, the cake bit here leads us very naturally back into How Strange a Season. And in particular, I would say from my estimation, and there's probably people with differing opinions on this, the cakiest story in that if I'm allowed to say that, is the heirloom.
Oh, yeah.
It's just so, and maybe, I'm susceptible to like boy logic of like, ooh, break things fun, and like I'm one of the people that would be out there. But could you describe that story, and then I have some more sort of fine grained questions.
If you'd asked me to select the cakiest story, that is also the one that I would have
Amazing.
selected. Yeah, so the gist of the story is that there's a woman who inherited a ranch from her mother, and the water has gone dry, and she's got to figure out a way to make money with this dry piece of land. And so she builds a place where people, mostly men, can come use bulldozers and just like large equipment to move things around and break things. And there's a sort of cathartic release for everyone at the end. I think I used the F word something like 18 times at the end of that. I think I was transferring my own like need for catharsis and frustration at a lot of things about the patriarchy, about climate, about what's coming, about what people refuse to see, about how it all kind of dovetails together in a polycrisis that's really painful. And you're right, like how to if you come at that with just your social consciousness, just your righteousness, no one wants to read it. So it's how do we make it interesting, surprising, fresh? And that was my attempt there.
And did that story, like, was that one of those stories that like was guided by that imagery? Like, what was the sort of kernel that brought you there?
I think it was a conversation I overheard on an airplane of someone talking about a place where you really could pay money to go use a bulldozer. And I thought that is just a really interesting slice of capitalism and also compelling. Like, part of me wanted to be like, I want to go, smash a car. So yeah, it came from that sliver. But I mean, as you and I've talked about a little bit as we were preparing for this, I'm really interested in women and labor and inheritance and flawed inheritance and what women do when the power structures don't support them traditionally. How do they move around that or within that? And so that's a big part of that story too.
Mm. Let's talk about that. I mean, there's a lot more to say here, so I think that particular point is going to be threaded throughout the conversation. But um, how does that play out in that particular story? Let's start there.
Yeah. So, there's the inheriting something from her mother, like inheriting land from her mother, which I think is really beautiful. And then, something I hope to give to my daughters in some way, especially land with like a good water source, maybe. But, and the fact that it's flawed, that it was, sucked dry by the almond industry, in the story. And so the well is dry, there's drought. And she's just forced to adapt to make something of it. And I think I love the idea of women and agility and women and grit and women making something out of nothing. When the systems of money and finance and power just don't set them up to do it traditionally.
Mm. The other thing I really loved about her character, like she's full of agency. I mean, she's like
Mm.
the embodiment of agency. Things are happening to her, but nothing is just like happening to her. It blows past any marker on the Bechdel test. Um, but the way that these aspects of like, so you've got the inheritance directly, but then you've also got the inheritance and play on the idea of a season. Like when her mother lived there, the water wasn't sucked dry. And so
Mhm.
she's inheriting this desiccated land. But it's also all these inheritances of polycrisis, of late
Yeah.
capitalism, of toxic gender dynamics. So you really like the information density is really really high with her character, and with that story in general. Um, so yeah, like were those pieces like when thinking through that broader dimension of inheritance, like talk to me about that, I guess is the where I'll
Yeah.
leave it.
Yeah, inheritance is sort of the theme for the entire collection of like we're inheriting a flawed world, we're inheriting flawed gender and power structures and labor structures, and then we inherit our own kind of like traumas. We pass along our own kind of traumas, but just these systems of I think also like just flawed systems. And so there's stories in the collection that take place in the American South where I was born. And I'm thinking about the sort of sickness that a lot of us inherent with, the systems, the land, what the land had been used for, what it will be used for, um, our awkward complicity and all of that, and the way we navigate it, what we remember, what we don't, what we take forth, what we don't, what we have to kind of tease out of our ways of operating. And I think during the pandemic, I think I was Yeah, no, this must have been early pandemic or just before the pandemic. I saw a class that was being held with a real dominatrix, and she was talking about how to wield power when you speak. And I'm 5'2", I'm blonde, I'm Southern, I smile a lot. I've always felt like a sort of hot-tempered radical inside my head, but nothing about how I move in the world really betrays that, and I get treated accordingly. Like the other day, I was in a hardware store, and the way the man was talking to me just there's nothing I could do professionally in my life. There's nothing I could achieve that would let me walk into a hardware store and be treated the way I aspire to be treated. um, and so I took a class, an online class with a dominatrix who talked about the power structures in language, even. And so that's actually a part of the heirloom. Because I actually picked up real strategies that I use, which is sort of fascinating to me and funny to me. And yeah.
Yeah, let's because that's I mean, I know that we're sort of talking this story to death a little bit, but, that first time you're exposed to the fact that she did take this dominatrix class and she's using the tactics, it's almost like an inverse Sopranos, like, instead of it being, like, somebody weaponizing their psychopathy, it's somebody claiming agency in a system that's trying to deny it them.
Yeah.
So if you could share maybe an example or 2 of the types of things she's doing with these men.
Yeah. So, one thing I learned when I took this class that was transferred into the story, which is when somebody asks you an unwanted question, you don't answer, but you turn the question back on them because you're turning that spotlight away from yourself and you're deflecting that invasive energy and returning it. And it's supposed to get rid of freeze, which a lot of women have. A lot of women experience freeze when they receive unwanted inquiries or unwanted contact or disrespect. And all my life, I've felt that way. And so I love that strategy of how do you deflect. And then she also has an employee who is a former football player who is aware that she's working on these things and is really supportive and knows when to step aside, knows when to insert himself. Yeah, so I was thinking a lot about just not even just word choice in language, but the way we relate to one another. And so she speaks very directly to the men that are there, to use the tools, and almost with a little condescension that one would expect to be present if the roles were reversed.
Mm. So I wanna stay with that question of not only language, but body language and sort of
Mm.
how we communicate and thinking about like, I think a lot of people think if you're a climate activist, you're supposed to be, like, very passionate and very animated, and whether or not you fall on the hope or sort of alarm side, like, it's all supposed to be very, like, direct and positive and, you're not supposed to use any dark tactics. Um, and this story makes a slanted argument, let's say. And I share in a very different way. I, of course, have, you know, the privilege of being a white man in American society, but a similar thing of like, I was also raised in the South. I was raised to be polite. And my partner Nancy always laughs. And so we'll have like back channel conversations where I'm like recapping something that happened and sort of saying what was going on in my head. And she calls that dark Jesse. She's like, nobody ever gets to see dark Jesse. One thing I've been really thinking about is particularly like on social media when you have people sort of making bad faith attacks or trolling or
Yeah.
whatever, particularly when you're trying to like put forward ideas that go against economic hegemony. Um, Kind of just wanted to take the mask off as a signaling exercise to other people. Like, no, we kind of got to use these. Not to stoop to like ad hominem attacks or not. I'm not
Yeah.
saying to be cruel, but like there's this really awkward thing for me where I'm trying to navigate that in myself of like, how do you do that appropriately where you are more in fighter mode? How are you thinking about that, both as a fiction writer, but also as a person and as a journalist in your communication, in your personal strategy, like using that more, um, I don't know, aggressive or more overt arguing back?
Yeah, I love that question and I love this topic. I'm a trained yoga teacher like every white lady in her 30s, I think. I'm in my 40s now, but I did that in my 30s. And I've read a ton of mindfulness books and I aspire to be a really mindful person who can let go of her ego. But I've noticed there's certain ways when I try to move professionally or out in the world or in a comment section of one of my pieces where I think I don't know if I'm serving the ideas I believe in or that I want for my daughters if I don't manage my ego here, or if I don't have a spine for what I believe in. I think it's easier to be passionate when you're really grounded in your values and you know what you're about and you know what you stand for. I can be pretty hot-tempered. I'm sensitive, so like I'll just feel everything a lot, whether that's love or sadness or anger, which is a secondary emotion to hurt. So usually I'm aware like, okay, I'm bruised if I'm feeling particularly spicy. I'm glad I have mindfulness strategies for that, but I also think there's something about being a woman in her 40s where I feel newly liberated in terms of I feel less obligated to make it easy and comfortable for everyone around me. I feel like I'm entering an era of my life where it's important not just for me, but the ideas that I'm committed to and also what I model for my two daughters who are 14 and 16 about how I will be treated in the world, what treatment I will accept, and what I'm fighting for them. And that gives me a lot of moral clarity, I think, in certain moments like that.
Mhm. I really appreciate that. Well, this brings up, so there's this middle section of the book. I mean, all the book is kind of threading issues of climate, not even climate crisis, but relationship to land, relationship to ecology. That's present throughout the whole book. But there's this middle section that's very directly tackling um, palpable issues of climate crisis as we understand it. So obviously you have the heirloom, then you have inheritance, which is sort of directly addressing this question of inheritance and sea level rise and changing climate. But then you also have a taste for lionfish, which is
Mm.
a character who is maybe less accustomed to embracing her agency. And so I want to talk about, I want to sort of segue the previous conversation into this one of like, what does it mean to write a character like that? What were you thinking about? And like, what were you trying to depict? Not that, again, I'm not trying to pretend like stories are meant to be like billboards for an issue or a way of being. They're meant to be
Mine totally
stories.
are. You're not
But
wrong.
yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I It's interesting that you asked about lionfish because I think it's analogous to a story from my second book, Almost Famous Women, called Saving Butterfly McQueen. And I think it's an issue as a Southerner that you might relate to having proximity to, which is evangelism, which is this idea of when we have an idea that we feel conviction about. And for me, that's nature, that's conservation, that's environmentalism. I was born that way. I've always it's just like a natural sense of justice in my body that I've felt since I was younger. My father used to say that I was going to start a Save the Tick club. Everybody worried I was going to fail my driver's license test because I would refuse to run over a squirrel, and those both of those things are actually like kind of plausible. Um, and in Saving Butterfly McQueen, and in this, Lionfish, A Taste for Lionfish story, I have characters who really care about something and they want to be the type of person who can go out and influence others. But I think the problem with evangelism, and this is something I struggle with as an activist in general, is I think because in the South I was evangelized to so much that I have such a distaste for it. I have like, don't come at me with that. Don't act as if I haven't considered my spiritual life or that this is, that you know best. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges of persuasive material of activism is it presumes that you know best or you've done your work and someone else hasn't in some way. And so, I mean, I think in its rawest form, I think when we do our work, we understand how to be more conversational about it. Um, but I'm really wrestling with that issue of this sort of righteousness of conviction.
Mm, I'll pray for you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. What a dangerous line. Yep.
Yeah. Um, well, so in that story, just to put some details to this, her um, aspirational evangelist crusade has to do with an invasive species, and that's intersecting with real issues of wealth inequality.
Mhm.
So maybe if you could kind of describe the sort of messy forces that you're playing with in that.
Yeah, I often feel like fiction, contemporary American fiction, doesn't really deal with vocation and socioeconomics very well, especially outside of urban areas. So
Mm,
I feel like the South is often neglected in contemporary fiction, and kind of blue collar labor. Um, is often neglected, or it's kind of romanticized a little bit. So, like, just because I've moved in those places and I grew up in rural North Carolina in a town called Rocky Mount, like, I feel some duty to present the reality of what it's like. And I also, I think, got a sense of this on assignment for The Guardian, driving places like Cancer Alley in Louisiana and talking to activists like Heather McTeer-Toney, who talked about to me about how people are talking about climate change. They're just not talking about it in elitist ways. They know when the fish change and the river changes, and so I think a lot about, like, what's the version of these conversations that's happening not at like the big green level or the Ivy League level, or I have a great vocabulary and a cool Nalgene water bottle covered in stickers level, but like the real on the ground level. And I think what is hard there is often we're looking for people to solve the problems that were created by capitalism or by corporations or by wealthy nations or wealthy people. And I wanted that mismatch to and the issues of like guilt, to be present in that story.
Mm. And do you find that that's an issue? Like, obviously, this came up in your Cancer Alley piece. Do you find that that's an issue that you see recurring in your journalistic work, like this kind of disconnect?
I do. I think for a long time, climate change had this like visual of being for second homeowners who had beach houses on stilts. I think or polar bears. And I think one of the, I don't want to say failures of climate comms, but I feel like we don't always talk about it in on the ground language, and we don't always think about how it affects people who aren't going to conferences and COP and different moving in these more elite conversations or conferences that take money to go to, like, where. And I think that's when the idea of trusted messengers really matters, and thinking about, in the South, I've seen this. There's an organization I work with, 100 miles off the coast of Georgia, and I think they do a brilliant job of kind of bipartisan, non-elitist, on the ground climate comms, and they talk to people who own seafood restaurants or people who are second generation shrimpers, and I think there hasn't been enough done in terms of how we kind of counterbalance the sort of MAGA, anti climate, anti science, anti regulation comments with, this is what it actually means for you and your kids and the planet and your livelihood, and like really on the ground terms. So, just as a climate professional and somebody who thinks about those things, I think about them creatively, like in this lionfish story, and I think about them practically in my consulting business.
All right, well, let's go there. So, switching hats real quick. And I know that obviously, like, given that you have clients and sensitive information, nothing I'm asking is asking you to put anybody on
Sure.
blast or to betray any confidential information. But maybe from a broad standpoint, obviously, an organization that finds GreenStory is already thinking like, oh, we need to we need to improve our comms. What do you find are sort of, let's say, common positionality that they're coming in with, maybe misconceptions or things they're already doing right but not doing enough of? Like, what are you finding in this work?
Yeah, I find people generally are playing it too safe right now. I have this wonderful business partner, Mike Farber, who is pure optimism and energy, and is like a perfect counterbalance to me, where I'm like, maybe a little more jaded, but like so eager. But he's pure optimism and experience, and we think about these things together a lot. And I think some of the things we see is that people are afraid to say who they really are right now, and to really commit out in the open about climate in this environment, and probably for good reason, because you could get a grant taken away, right? If you use a vocab word that triggers someone in a grant making capacity. Those are realities, and I think language is an interesting consideration right now. But in terms of branding and in terms of reaching investors, like, I will say, it's given me more hope to see. We work with a lot of people out of MIT and Harvard, to see the level of innovation and brilliance and capacity that's in this new technology, that if it gets supported can actually make significant changes in the way that we live, and carbon amounts and alternative energy sources and nuclear breakthroughs. And it's really powerful to see that. And often when you have people of science, they have not been taught to speak in first person. They have, speaking in first person with passion is kind of taboo. And so, again, it's that ability to translate, like, I see what you're doing here, and let me teach you how to talk about it in a story form, so you can capture the kind of wonder of what you do and the awe, but we can keep it simple. We don't use jargon, like let's it's just language choices that help translate it from a lab to a consumer or a decision maker. And Mike and I only work with companies that and nonprofits that we think are doing good work in the world. I will say that is harder. Like, we started off very idealistically about that, like only working with good companies, and it's actually harder than I thought to say who is actually a good company and how will they use this technology and who's on the board and how will it be applied. And so I guess that's one like spicy piece of insight I can offer, is that that's sort of an interesting lens. But that said, I think we've worked with amazing people and brilliant minds. And it's fun to kind of plug in and think about this next generation of tools and leaders. It is truly for me a drop of hope in a kind of a dark time.
Mm. Yeah, one thing that I've really found myself saying in conversation a lot, given the stakes, is like, we have to be okay with imperfect allies. Like, I think about, there's this graphic essay that I recommend to everyone. I don't know if you've read it. It's called "We Call It Pala" or Pala.
Mm-mm.
I'd really recommend reading it. It's a graphic essay that somebody wrote slash drew, obviously. That's looking at the sort of burgeoning excitement around the legalization of psilocybin. And so it's a psilocybin company, hypothetical, obviously, that's talking about all the idealism that this founder is going into creating that company, and all the commitments that they make when they first start creating that company. But then all the pressures of fundraising and having a board and having competitors. It's a journey in how even that, with all the best intentions, turns into the thing that founder swore it never would be. And knowing that these are systemic pressures means that inherently we're not going to get to work with people who are necessarily doing things the way you wish they would be doing them, because that might not be an option available to them under the circumstances that they have. So I just really appreciate that point. And it's glad to hear that have thus far been able to work with folks that you're really excited to work with.
I want to pause on what you just said, because I wholeheartedly agree. And I think I think in the climate movement, we have a lot of purity tests that don't really serve our outcomes. So this idea of working with people with whom we might disagree or who are not perfect partners, I mean, you had a very elegant way of phrasing that. I remember I used to be part of this historic preservation organization in North Carolina. And I was talking with the head of it, and she said, our biggest ally, if we could get them on our side, would be Walmart, which was a crazy thing to say. But it was during the development boom in the mid-2000s, and it was about land usage and, habitat preservation and not destroying old homes and the location of things. So I think it's always important to think in terms of scale. And I've become a big believer in organizations like Conservation Law Foundation and Southern Environmental Law Center, because at the legal level, the scale, like, while it feels like kind of you want to hold your nose sometimes, you're like, oh, another lawsuit. But you think about holding people to regulations and what that means in terms of scale is so huge. And yeah, it feels sometimes maybe a little jaded to think about terms of scale, but the more I'm in this and the more I think about outcomes, and also just growing up in the South, which you had to do as well.
I love that
Um,
phrasing.
like, I've often thought about, I am a secular person now, but I often think about the creation care movement, and if we could really put stewardship in the language of religion. And Dr. Catherine Wilkinson wrote a brilliant book called Between God and Green that I think it really gets to this. But I keep thinking, like, there is such a beautiful scriptural case for creation care. And again, this is not my team, but when I think about storytelling and language and partnering with people with whom I don't totally see eye to eye on, there is the scale of that feels so huge to me that feels like an undertended narrative and collaborative opportunity to me.
Mm. Well, I mean, I can attest to this in my own life, and not even, I was raised Catholic, so a different. It's not an evangelical tradition, but there's a lot of evangelism in Catholicism too, or at least in the South. But more recently, when I left my MFA, and of course, like, my professors were very kind to point out that it's so great that you did this MFA and are developing your craft, but you're going to have to figure out what to do for work.
Mhm.
And so I wore a lot of hats, and among them was journalism. And I established a beat. I was really obsessed with digital culture at the time. This was a early 2010s, and the ways that media was reshaping our relationship to reality. And that, through a weird series of happenstance interactions with people and intuition, led me to carve out a beat covering emerging technologies. And it was only, to make a long story short, it was only through doing that for a number of years that I came to really intimately understand what was so problematic in the narratives undergirding technologies. Like, I could identify, like, one thing I was obsessed with even back then was the way that social media was changing our brains, and likely not for the better. But then my answer to that was, oh, there's this new realm of technology, these virtual and augmented reality technologies that maybe are a way to add intimacy and presence back into the digital realm, and maybe that will be the solution. And I can see now why I made that calculus, but also why that was really flawed. But I don't think if I'd ever done that, I would have come to intimately understand that narrative. So I
Mm.
think about that in terms of like the Walmart example. Who knows how many people working at Walmart are halfway there, but right now it looks like they have it ass backwards. But
Yeah.
actually it's like there's almost this Ouroboros where it's like at a certain point you're like you have all the data you thought you needed to get to one place, but actually you got back to this place of like, oh, I realize I'm in a totally different place, and maybe they'll be critical change agents. And if there's not any bridging with them, if there's not space and sort of language and narrative to draw that out of them, then they are just going to stay status quoing.
I love the evocation of people who are halfway there. I mean, as somebody who grew up in a red state, in a pretty red community, I was halfway there just in terms of like thinking about my values and what I cared about. And so whenever people are like, oh, I'm going to boycott the South, or I'm going to, and I just think, oh my God, there's so many people like me who are almost there. And there's a case to like go in and have a conversation, and extend a hand, and staying accessible and staying open. That doesn't mean platforming or affirming necessarily. There's a, um, a retired Middlebury professor named John Elder who gave a lecture in my class, and he talked about the idea of tact and this idea of staying in contact with people with whom you disagree. So, um, it was this idea of like we're so separate and we use such separate language and we operate in such separate spheres that we can't influence each other and we can't find that common ground. But if we work on this tactfulness, this like staying in contact with the other side, or people from other beliefs or slightly different beliefs, that there's actually capacity for influence there and a conversation. And I have been thinking about that so much in terms of language and storytelling and what we do.
Mm. Well, I mean, coming back to some other pieces that you said, it's like, particularly on the left, particularly where there are these purity tests, part of the way those purity tests are enforced is this hyper niche language. And I think that as a thought experiment in the direction of a more just world, that's great. But it's not hard to see how that language feels very alienating. And I'm not like doing a anti-woke thing here.
Yeah.
But like using $5 words that are the result of like a lot of kind of like nerding out in service of a more just world, which is a cause I can get behind, then gets us away from the very elemental ways we could communicate the same ideas. And to your point, it's even in the Bible. Like, taking care of the earth is in the Bible. So why aren't we using, like, language is this amazing opportunity, and we purport to be people who are really committed to the right language, but then somehow that's not translating to understanding how to meet somebody where they are with their language.
Yeah, I always tell my students clarity is a form of sophistication. So I think, I often talk about Beatles pop songs as an example of like great communication, because it is hard work to create something that's simple and beautiful and universal, and I think our language can be the same thing, especially when we're thinking about efficacy of our climate communications. Is how do we retain our intensity, our ideas, the beauty of our ideas, our values, but also like frame them in accessible and simple ways and welcome more people to the conversation. Um, I think, I mean, a lot of places I go and lecture and do this sort of work, I see people like you're talking about that are right there, and it feels daunting. I've even had students in Middlebury tell me, well, I feel like I don't have the right water bottle, and they're joking about it, but like the environmental movement like looks a certain way and acts a certain way and speaks a certain way, and I believe that we could welcome so many more people into these causes, and that we actually, whether it's like outdoors people who hunt and fish, or it's people who care about creation care and stewardship from a more scripture-based way. There are groups of people who are kind and want better outcomes for the planet that we're missing in this conversation. And I would love to keep thinking collectively with other people about how do we better have those conversations.
Mm. Well, as a starting point, I absolutely love what you said, and I just wish I'd been able to have you as a professor uh, once upon a time. But now I get to talk to you here, so I get it. I get it this way. And to echo your example around hunting, I think you've really hit on something that, again, the environmental movement is in most cases really hostile to. But and I won't name this person, but I grew up in North Florida, right near the Georgia border,
Mhm.
and so he's a deep hunter, but particularly a deer hunter. And he actually hunts with a crossbow, and he's quite good. And his wife saw him outside with the carcass, and he was kind of just kneeling over it, but not skinning it, not doing anything. And she didn't understand what was going on, and so she asked him later, and he was basically saying that he was thanking the land and thanking the deer, but not in a performative way. It was like just something that he does when he hunts. And so growing up around people like that who hunt, you recognize there's a deep reverence actually for ecological relating. They're not calling it ecological relating. And that's something that clearly is threaded throughout human history. I mean, there's so many different indigenous cultures where that was common practice. And so what are the ways that we as a movement of people who care about keeping the earth habitable, how do we invite them in? How do we make that big tent? I don't know if you have any further thoughts or insights on that.
I love that question. I think Robin Wall Kimmerer did an amazing job writing a book where she talks about the honorable harvest and making that idea accessible and beautiful, and that sort of gratitude. And you're right, like indigenous cultures had this balance, much more in check. So I wrote a column about fisheries for The Guardian, and I was interviewing some native Hawaiians about their creation myth, which begins with the coral polyp, which builds the reef, which, in terms of hierarchy, does not have humans sitting on top of of things there. Um, and taking what one needs versus just taking recklessly. And I think it's a stunning concept. And there's a lot, as you say, that we're leaving on the table, like Ducks Unlimited, in terms of, so I can't shoot anything. I escort spiders out of my house shrieking, but I try to get them out. I try not to just needlessly kill things. So obviously you're not going to see me out in the world shooting birds, but if we didn't have conserved habitat from Ducks Unlimited, who own massive and oversee massive tracts of land and former rice fields, the Atlantic Flyway would not function. Um, and these sort of strategic partnerships with whom people with whom we might not completely see eye to eye on all these issues with, are just, I think they're absolutely imperative. And I would say Florida, where you're from, actually has a pretty, people don't know it, but their bipartisan conservation work is pretty impressive. Like the way the ranchers are partnering with some of the conservationists to make wildlife corridors. It is possible. It's hard, but it's possible.
Mm. By the way, I see that we're coming up on the hour mark. I want to make sure. Do you have a hard out in 2 minutes, or do you have a little bit extra?
I have a little bit extra.
Okay, great. Because I want to spend a tiny bit of time here talking about your work with the Bread Loaf Environmental Writers Conference. So we've talked a lot about the kind of green story and your public communication angle, like how to communicate to the public. But what do you try to foster at Bread Loaf when you're communicating to writers about environmental writing and the curatorial decisions you're making about who lectures? Like, talk to me about your thought process and all that.
Yeah. And one of the things I've been overseeing that conference, with Jennifer Groats for about 7 years, 8 years maybe. And I loved the challenge of, can we change the face of who thinks of themselves as an environmental writer? Um, because I think it used to look like a man with expendable income in a tweed suit, looking over some fields and having some deep thoughts about, yeah, yeah, like outfitted by Abercrombie and Fitch, looking fly, good gear. And I think I want to live in a world where anyone from anywhere can consider themselves an environmental writer. They don't have to have, disposable income and, on a great ski vacation to feel that way. Um, I want people in urban environments to feel that way. And we've had Emily Rabateau on faculty a couple times. We've had Drew Lanham, who is a wonderful ornithologist from South Carolina, who talks about, birding while black and is so passionate about birds, the complexity of Audubon's heritage. Um, I just wanted a world in which, the conversation about who can think about themselves as an environmental writer, who's platformed, and what we talk about, what we consider our lane. And I think it has become much more urgent, and our applications show that. But I love the people who come because I think they already tend to look outside of themselves. So it feels very low ego, very non-hierarchical, and just a really shared desire to do a better job of reaching the public about environmental issues. And I love the multi-genre opportunity. So we have people who write like classic magazine pieces and nonfiction. And we also have fiction, which I feel like can do, when I think about it in my own practice, I feel like if there's something I need to shine a light on factually and in short time, that's a journalism piece. If there's something where I want to talk about the existential and spiritual attacks of a degraded environment, for me, that's fiction, because that's harder to get at in journalism. But I think we can, over time and with complexity, lead people there in fiction. And, poetry is always out there doing gorgeous work in the world. But I love our faculty and I love our community. And I think we've really been able to create something pretty original there. So thank you for asking me about it. I care about it so much. Like, I want everybody to feel like they can find their voice in this conversation because we need everybody to feel that way. Everybody has an environmental story, an environmental angle.
Totally. And I don't mean this in like a cheesy promotional way, but just to like, on the flip side, what's feedback that you've heard from people that have gone through it?
Yeah, I mean, I think people feel like we're doing a really healthy job of kind of opening up the margins about who sees themselves, as an environmental writer and who can come to the conference. I wish I had more scholarship money to give because, at the end of the day, we have a couple of full scholarships, but at the end of the day, it still takes, disposable income to get yourself to the conference, to take time away from work, to take time away from caregiving and be there and be in that community and meet with editors it catalyzes people's work. We've had several book deals, article placements, and a lot of artistic growth that happens there, but I would love to give it more widely. And right now I just don't have the money to do that. And so for me, that's always the pressing problem of any great educational opportunity is just how do you get more people in the door that deserve to be there.
So funders, hint, hint.
Yeah, if you're just sitting on a pile of money, let me know.
Grant, time for a new grant. It's urgently needed right now.
Exactly.
Amazing. So last question on this front, and then I have like 3 questions I like to close every conversation with. So that's more like lightning round style, but feel free to take as long as you want. But the last question I have for you is, by and large, from my estimation, most climate fiction fails. I think the times it succeeds tremendously. Obviously, I mean, everybody talks about Ministry for the Future now. But I want to get your take as somebody who both writes climate fiction, who also organizes education around, among other things, climate fiction. What do you think are the pitfalls or mistakes that cause climate fiction not to work? Because obviously we need all of it, but ideally it's good because we don't want bad climate fiction that makes people think it's not worth reading.
I'm with you. I think a lot of it's bad too. I think there's an era where, and we might be at the end of it, but I feel like for the last few years now, there was like a book that had a plot point that was like, and climate change happened, or like there was a disaster. And to me, I think that reads as disingenuous because it has been happening. It applies pressure every day to our lives, our weather systems. And so I think sometimes it's a desire to it's a little bit of like climate fiction greenwash, where it's like the conceit itself is a little shallowly conceived. And I think you can always tell when, it's the esse quam videre, to be rather than to seem. Like, have you been deep in this work and this thought to earn the reader's time and we have to do it with who we represent on the page and we have to do it with the topics in which we trade of like, do we have the knowledge and the lived experience, and are we seeking it and giving it our best? And I have a friend, Rebecca Shinsky, who helps run Book Riot, and they've been doing this podcast called Zero to Well Read. And she went back and read Zora Neale Hurston, Their Eyes Were Watching God, and she told me one of the beautiful things she noticed was like a book from the before times mind, like this sort of mind that wasn't riddled with holes from the internet, and that was, stitching together such beautiful observation. And I would love to see climate fiction come from that deeply observed place and that thoughtful place, and not a how are we going to make this into a movie place. Because it is, I think, deeply existential and spiritual. And I think the Overstory or books like that maybe get to that. They hit that note. It's a hard note to hit. I think the other reason climate fiction fails is that it's often righteous, and we generally will not sign up for righteousness. And righteousness is also like it's flat. It's a frying pan like this. We can, if we can feel the writer's agenda, there's no discovery. So I think it's learning how to let people be imperfect, and to build in arcs of discovery. So I would say substance and righteousness are really the pitfalls, and it kind of gets back to the cake. Like you have to learn how to, I think in fiction especially, the cake has to be good, the narrative has to be good, the characters have to be good, the ideas have to be hidden well enough where the reader comes to them on their own, and it's not, the frying pan behind the shoulder.
Wow. That was like a 2-minute masterclass. I hope every writer sees
Yeah.
that bit. Okay, great. So I have these 3 questions. As I said, treat them as a lightning round or take as long as you want. And also, you might have already referenced some things that would be the answers to these questions, so feel free to call that back in. There's no harm of repeating and expanding.
Okay.
What is one thing you wish people paid more attention to?
Their yards. I think looking at your lawn and your little micro habitat as a place where you can practice stewardship.
Amazing. What is one resource you recommend for making better sense of reality?
Oh, a meditation practice.
Mm. And finally, what is one moment when your sense of reality was disrupted?
Oh, wow. I think my sense of reality is often disrupted. I'm a dreamer. I think I can get hijacked by music, and it sends me off into a daydream. I would say this morning, so it was rainy this morning and I was at the dentist. No fun, not a good setup, and there was a song on, and it very luckily hijacked my sense of reality. And I, like, kind of came to minutes later and was like, "Oh my god, someone's scraping my teeth." But it was nice to take a break.
Amazing. Well, I'm glad you had something to soften the blow of a dentist visit. Poor dentists. They're doing good
Mine
work
are
and we just
wonderful.
all
Mine are wonderful. Yeah, it's a tough gig.
yeah. Megan, this has been amazing. I went in with high expectations and it even exceeded those. So just thank you so much for sharing all your insights and joining me for a conversation.
Yeah, thanks for the work you do. These are important conversations.
Thank you.